Bonjour à tous et à toutes.
Good
Donc,
afternoon,
je suis
everybody.
très heureux
I'm
de vous
very happy
accueillir pour
to welcome
cette
you to this
deuxième journée de
second
cette
day
conférence
of this
co-organisée par
conference,
la Banque de France, la
co-organized by
FERDI
Banque de
et
France,
l'AFD.
FERDI, and the
Hier,
AFD.
le premier webinaire a porté sur la
Yesterday, the
question
first
du
webinar was
financement
about
privé
the
et
issue of
aujourd'hui, on
private
va
financing,
compléter
and today
cette première
we'll
session
round
par
out that first
une session
session
qui va être
with one
dévouée aujourd'hui au
focusing
financement public
today
et
on public
notamment au
financing,
rôle des
and in
banques
particular, the role of
de
banks,
développement.
of development banks.
Alors, on a un petit peu changé la
Now, we've changed
configuration
the
de
configuration
ce
somewhat
webinaire par rapport à ce
of
qui
this
était initialement
webinar
prévu.
compared to what was
D'une part
initially
parce que
planned.
M.
Firstly,
Ekoué,
because Mr. Ekwe,
qui était le président de la banque
chair of the
de développement, n'a pas pu se joindre à nous,
West
donc il
African
a été
Development Bank,
remplacé
was
par
unable
M. Moglo.
to attend. He's been
Et
replaced by
puis
Mr.
ensuite,
Muglo. And
Audrey Rochkoff
thereafter,
finalement va rejoindre le panel, donc on va
Audrey
plutôt
Roshkov
s'orienter
will join
vers
the panel and will
une,
focus
une discussion sous forme de panel.
on a
Alors je vais
panel
rapidement
discussion.
introduire le
I'm
sujet, et puis
going to
ensuite
briefly
je
introduce
présenterai
the issue,
les
and then I'll
différents membres de
present
ce panel.
the various members of the
Alors
panel.
aujourd'hui, donc on va
Today,
traiter la question du
we're
rôle
going to look at the question of the
des banques
role
publiques de
of
développement dans la
public development banks
mobilisation et l'allocation des
in
financements
mobilizing and
contre
allocating
la
funding
lutte contre le
for the
changement
fight
climatique.
against
Alors,
climate change.
le contexte, il est un peu
The
particulier,
context
donc
is somewhat
ce
unusual
webinaire
because this
est
webinar
particulièrement important,
is particularly
puisque
important,
ce qu'on
therefore,
constate aujourd'hui,
as
c'est
we've
que l'aide
noted
publique se
today
réduit
that public aid
assez fortement
is
dans
reduced
un contexte qui
quite
se
sharply in a context
caractérise par plusieurs
that can best be
effets qui se
qualified
combinent.
by
Le
various
premier, c'est les difficultés
combinatory effects.
budgétaires qu'on
Is
rencontre un petit peu
the
partout dans le monde
budgetary constraints
et
that we
qui
can see
vont
pretty much all over the
restreindre un
world
petit peu
that
ce
will
qu'on
restrict
caractérise parfois par l'espace
what we can
fiscal.
say, what we
Donc
call
ça se
the
traduit par
tax
deux choses.
space, the
La
tax area.
première,
And
c'est
that
une
means two
réduction des
things. The
volumes
first
de
is a reduction in
financement
volumes
et la deuxième,
of
c'est
financing, and
une
secondly,
rationalisation
a
et une recherche
streamlining
d'efficacité.
and
Donc on
search
aura
for
l'occasion dans
efficiency.
ce panel
And
d'aborder
we'll
aussi la
have
question de la
in this
mesure,
panel
des
the
métriques.
opportunity to talk about the measurement, the metrics,
Dans l'effort de
in
rationalisation,
the effort
il y a
to
notamment donc la question
streamline.
de l'efficacité
There is the issue
des aides
of
publiques. Et donc
the
ça pose
efficiency
aussi
of public
parfois la question
assistance.
de l'allocation
This
des
also
ressources
raises the question of the allocation
avec
of
un constat
resources
qui est
with an
suivant, c'est que
observation
pour des
as
mauvaises
follows,
raisons ou des bonnes raisons
and for good or bad reasons
qui peuvent être liées à des problèmes de gouvernance ou de
that may
tensions
relate
parfois
to
sécuritaires ou
governance
politiques,
or security or
l'aide
geopolitical
n'atteint
issues.
pas nécessairement les pays
Aid
les plus
doesn't
vulnérables, mais les
necessarily
pays
arrive in
intermédiaires.
the most vulnerable countries, but in
Ce ne sont
intermediary
pas
countries,
nécessairement
which aren't necessarily the most
affectés qui bénéficient des
affected,
aides. Donc,
that
ça
will
pose
be the
une
ones
question
receiving
de
aid.
l'orientation et de l'efficacité
So
de
we're
ces
talking
aides.
about the direction
Et
and the
puis le
efficiency of
contexte que l'on
assistance,
connaît
and
aujourd'hui,
the context
c'est
that we know
aussi
today,
un peu une perte de momentum
which is a
sur les
lack
questions
or loss
climatiques
of momentum in the
qu'on
issues to
observe
do with
à
climate
un
change
niveau
that we have seen
international
at an international
et qui
level,
pose la question
and which
aussi
raises the
de la
question
complémentarité entre
of
la
how
finance climat
complementary
et le
climate
financement du
financing
développement. Alors
and
c'est une
development
question qui n'est pas
financing
si simple,
are.
notamment en
Now,
Afrique,
this isn't such an
où
easy
on a un
question, in
certain nombre
particular
de
in Africa,
pays
where we have a number of
qui
countries
disposent
that
d'énormes ressources naturelles, en
have
particulier
huge
fossiles,
natural
et dont
resources,
le
and particularly
développement
fossil
s'appuie
ones,
précisément sur
and their
le
development
pétrole,
is based in
l'exploitation
particular
de ces
on
énergies.
oil and
Donc la
the
question, c'est de
exploitation of
savoir
this
également
energy.
comment
So the
ça
question there is
s'articule
to
avec
see how
le
does this
financement du climat.
fit into
Alors la façon
financing
dont on
the
va
climate.
procéder dans ce panel, c'est qu'on
How
va
are we going to go
commencer
about
par
things at the panel? We
des
will start off
intervenants qui vont nous
with the
présenter une
speakers
vision
who
peut-être un petit
will give
peu
us a
globale
vision that's
de
more
l'aide au
global,
financement
perhaps,
et en
of
particulier du
financing
rôle des
aid,
banques
and
publiques
in particular
dans
the
le
role of
financement.
public banks
Et puis
in
on va
financing.
descendre
And
ensuite
then we will go
un
down
peu plus dans le détail avec
into more
des exemples
detail
concrets
with
de
concrete
banques.
examples of
Donc on va en
banks.
quelque sorte ouvrir le capot
So
pour
we'll
comprendre un
open
petit
up the
peu
hood, so
comment
to speak,
s'effectuent
to
les
see
choix, quels types d'instruments sont
how
utilisés
decisions are made, what
pour
kind of instruments are
favoriser
used
ces aides au développement.
to
Alors,
ensure
sur
these
le rôle des
development
banques publiques, il y a
assistance
plusieurs questions qui se
vehicles.
posent,
Now, for public
je
banks,
pose
there are
d'ores et
various
déjà
questions raised.
aux
I'm
membres
already
du panel.
asking the members of
La
the
première, c'est
panel.
quel
The
est
first
le rôle
is,
de ces banques
what is the
publiques dans
role
la nouvelle
of public banks
architecture
in the new
financière
architecture
internationale qui se
for
développe.
international financing that
La
is
deuxième question,
emerging?
c'est un petit
The
peu
second
comment ça
question
s'articule
is
en
a bit
fait
more, how is the
avec les différents
structure
niveaux. Donc, on a des banques
with the various levels? We've got banks
multilatérales
that
de
are
développement,
multilateral
des banques
development
nationales de
banks.
développement,
We've
des
got
banques locales,
internationals, we've got local
des
ones,
institutions publiques. Donc,
public
comment
institutions,
s'organisent toutes,
how
toutes ces aides et
is
ses
all of this
financements, comment ça
aid
se structure,
organized and how is financing
et puis
structured?
ensuite, comment sont
And then
alloués ces
how
financements, donc quels sont les
is
critères
financing
qu'ils ont
allocated?
retenus
What are the criteria
pour,
used
allouer les ressources?
to allocate
Quelle est
a
la part
resource?
relative
What is the
attribuée à
relative
l'atténuation et
proportion
à
of
l'adaptation, en
attenuation
particulier
as
dans
opposed
des
to
pays pour
adaptation,
lesquels les besoins
in
d'infrastructures
particular in
sont
countries
énormes?
where the
Et on
infrastructure requirement is
abordera
huge?
aussi la question des
And
leviers
we'll
des
also
ressources
talk about
publiques.
drivers
Et pour faire
of public
le
resources,
lien avec
levers,
ce qu'on
and
a
to
vu
tie
hier,
in with
c'était
what we saw
quel est le
yesterday,
rôle des financements hybrides,
which
des
is what is the role
partenariats
of hybrid
public-privé,
financing, public
quels
and
sont
private partnerships,
les leviers les plus efficaces
the
pour
most
mobiliser
efficient drivers,
les
therefore,
financements, en
to
particulier
mobilize
vers le continent
financing,
africain.
in particular
Et donc là, on
towards the African
bénéficiera
continent.
de
And there we
différents points de
will
vue.
benefit
Alors, les
from various
panélistes,
points of
on a de
view.
la chance
Panelists,
d'avoir
we are
aujourd'hui
fortunate enough to
5
have
panélistes
5
avec des points de vue
panelists
très différents mais
with very
complémentaires.
different points of view, but they
Alors,
are
je vais les présenter
complementary.
dans l'ordre
And in order
d'intervention. Donc, la
of
première qui
speaking,
interviendra,
the
c'est
first
Audrey Rochecoff,
is
qui travaille
Audrey
à l'Agence
Rochkoff,
française de
who works at
développement
the Agence
et qui
Française de
dirige
Développement,
la
the
division
AFD,
climat,
and
nature
directs the
de
Climate Nature
l'AFD.
Direction or
Elle sera
Directorate.
ensuite suivie par
She
Thomas
will be
Revial,
followed by
qui est
Thomas
chef du service des
Revial,
affaires
head of the
multilatérales et du
multilateral
développement à
and
la
development
Direction générale du Trésor.
affairs at the
Nous aurons
Director General
ensuite le
of the
docteur
Treasury,
Manglo,
the French Treasury,
qui
then Dr. Monglo,
représente la Banque
representing
ouest-africaine
the
de
West African
développement
Development
et
Bank,
qui siège aussi
and
donc
who also has a seat,
je sais pas comment la traduction française en
I don't know what the French translation of this, of
l'IDFC, voilà,
the
l'Institut
ADFC,
de
basically,
financement de
the
développement des clubs des banques de développement, voilà, donc,
for development
qui
bank
représente
clubs,
la BOAD.
and so he'll be representing
Ensuite,
the
on rentrera
BOAD,
donc dans des cas un petit peu plus
and then we'll go
concrets,
into more
pratiques,
concrete
avec
cases,
deux
practical ones,
intervenants,
with
Monsieur
two
Ali
speakers,
Bensouda, qui est le secrétaire
Mr. Ali
général
Bensouda, Secretary
de
General,
la
General
Caisse de
Counsel
dépôt et
of
de
the
gestion
Moroccan
du
Caisse
Maroc.
de dépôt et de
Et on
gestion,
terminera ensuite par
to conclude
avec Madame
with
Campetta Pichet
Madam
Sayingoza,
Competa
qui est
Pichet
la directrice
Sayingoza,
générale
Kainzoga, sorry,
de la Banque de développement du
Director
Rwanda.
General of the Development Bank of
Alors, sans
Rwanda.
plus attendre,
Without further ado,
donc, je vais laisser la parole à
I will
Madame
hand over the
Rochecoff.
floor to
Donc, chaque
Ms.
intervenant va
Rushkoff.
vous présenter un
Each
petit peu son point de
speaker will
vue
present his or
pendant
her
une
point of
dizaine de
view
minutes
for
avec
about 10
l'angle
minutes,
particulier, encore une
with
fois,
a specific
part
focus
du
once again
général et on va vers le
of going from
spécifique.
the general
Audrey, je vous
to
laisse la
the
parole.
specific. Audrey, over to you.
Merci beaucoup. Merci pour
Thank you very
l'invitation.
much.
Bonjour à
Thank you
tous.
for your
Alors, initialement,
invitation. Hello, everybody.
désolée de ne pas
Initially,
venir
as
You
you see, you
se
asked
reprendre.
Mr.
Je m'excuse
Rio,
aussi
and I
pour son
would like to
absence. Il est en
apologize
déplacement
for his
aujourd'hui.
absence.
Et
He's traveling
je
today.
vais vous livrer
I
le point de
will
vue
give
en tant
the
que
point of
faisant
view
mon travail à l'AFD
of
avec
what we're doing at the
quelques messages.
AFD
Mais
with
d'abord,
some messages.
peut-être le
But
premier
first of
pour
all, the
reprendre un
first
peu
to go
vos
over
propos introductifs
my
pour
introduction
parler de
to talk about
la lutte contre le changement climatique versus le développement
the
économique et
struggle
social.
against climate change as
Je
opposed
vous
to a social and
rejoins
economic
sur
context,
l'articulation qu'on a besoin de
where I
faire
go
entre
back
ces
to that
concepts.
structure
On
that we need to
entend
have between these
parfois dire
concepts.
que dans un
Sometimes we hear
contexte de
that in a
restrictions
context
budgétaires,
of budgetary
il
restrictions,
est difficile de faire les deux,
it is
que
difficult to do both.
l'action climatique peut peut-être nous
Climate
divertir
change
de notre
may, in
mission de
fact, divert
développement
us from
économique et
our
social,
mission, our
mais
macroeconomic and social mission,
on a quand même
but
de l'expérience,
we do
plusieurs
have
projets, plusieurs
experience
stratégies
in
qui nous
multiple
permettent
projects and multiple strategies that make
de
it
lier les
possible
deux.
to tie in both of these.
Ce ne sont pas chez nous des priorités
These
concurrentes,
are not competing priorities,
voire si on
and
déploie les
even
efforts de
we
façon
see whether the effort made
stratégique avec des
for
critères
that strategic effort
qualitatifs,
with quality
un
criteria,
agenda peut servir l'autre,
one agenda might be able to help
voire
another
ils se renforcent
and
mutuellement.
even
Et
be
en tout
mutually
cas, on a
complementary.
l'impression qu'il ne saurait y avoir de prospérité
And there wouldn't
durable
be, in
sans
any case,
résilience
any sustainable
climatique, ni de
prosperity without
transition
some sort of
écologique
climate
sans inclusion
ease
économique et sociale.
and a more specific version, in fact, in the
On a souvent parlé
macroeconomic climate.
de ça
We
et en
need to talk about
particulier dans le
this, and in
contexte de la
particular in
transition
the
énergétique
context
juste.
of a fair ecological transition,
La transition vers des sources
a transition
d'énergie
towards
décarbonées non
decarbonated
seulement ne s'oppose
energy
pas
sources is not
à
only
l'augmentation du
based
bien-être des
on the
populations,
increase in the
mais
well-being of
probablement
our
est une
populations, but also
opportunité
an
d'ouvrir des
opportunity
perspectives, de
to
créer de
open up an
l'emploi
outlook, create jobs,
de réduire les inégalités,
reduce
etc.
inequalities.
Un deuxième message,
A
peut-être
second
pour
message, perhaps,
vous parler un petit peu de l'écosystème
to
des banques
talk
publiques de
about
développement
the public development bank
et
systems
de leur rôle un peu dans
and
l'action
their role
climatique et dans
in climate
l'architecture
change
financière internationale.
and the architecture of international
Alors,
financing.
quand on parle des banques publiques de
When we talk
développement, on
about
parle de
public
plus de
development banks,
540
we're talking about over
établissements
540
financiers, hein, à
establishments,
travers le
financial
monde. On a bien
institutions
sûr des
worldwide.
banques
Of
multilatérales
course,
comme la
we've got
Société
multilateral banks.
mondiale,
You
la
know
Banque
about those.
africaine de développement. On a aussi des banques régionales comme
We've also got
la
regional
BOAD,
banks, such as
par
the
exemple, et on
BOAD,
a surtout un
for
très large
example. But
écosystème
we've
de
also got a
banques
very
nationales
broad
de développement.
ecosystem of
Alors parfois, il y en
national
a même
development
plusieurs
banks,
dans un seul
and there are
pays,
even
puisqu'elles sont
sometimes multiple ones
spécialisées
in a
sur des
given country,
thématiques. On connaît les banques
specializing
de
in specific
l'État,
themes. We're thinking
les
about
banques de l'agriculture, par
state
exemple.
banks or agricultural banks, for example.
Et ensemble, elles gèrent
And together,
23 000
they
milliards
manage
de
$23
dollars d'actifs
trillion
et
in
investissent chaque
assets
année plus de
and invest
2500
each
milliards de
year
dollars,
over
soit
$200
plus de
billion per
10%
year.
de
In other words, more
l'investissement
than
mondial.
10%
Donc,
in
c'est
global investment.
véritablement un
So it is
levier
genuinely
pour
a
faire
lever
évoluer tout le système
to
financier. C'est de la finance publique
change the
et
entire
c'est le
system. It
sujet
is public
d'aujourd'hui
assistance.
qui a
This
ce
is an issue
potentiel de
which has this
réorienter tout le
potential
reste des flux
to
financiers.
refocus all
Depuis
financial
2020,
movements.
ces
Since
banques se
2020,
réunissent dans la
these
coalition
banks
finance en commun.
have been
Alors
there in
2020,
the
vous vous
common
souvenez, c'était
banking solution, as you
au moment
recall.
du Covid et
This
au
was
moment
during
où on se
2020. This was
disait qu'il
during
était
the public health
urgent
crisis,
de
and we were
coordonner
saying to ourselves it was
nos
urgent to
réponses
coordinate our responses
et qu'elles soient plus durables. Donc la
for it
coalition
to
s'est
be more
formée à ce
sustainable.
moment-là
So that coalition was formed at that
avec
point
l'idée
with
de
the
bâtir un
idea
cadre commun
of
pour notre
building a
contribution
common
aux enjeux
framework
globaux
for our contribution to the
plutôt que
stakes
d'avoir des actions dispersées.
instead of having
Alors,
dispersed actions.
nos principaux points
Our
de discussion
main
entre banques publiques de
points of
développement, c'est
discussion
d'abord de
in
renforcer
this
la coopération
approach
entre nous,
was to reinforce cooperation among us,
entre nous, les
among
banques,
us,
et aussi
us
avec les
banks,
acteurs
but
de
also
notre
with
écosystème
actors in
qui
our ecosystem
participent au financement du
that
développement.
contribute
Donc, on
to
a la
financing
société civile, on
development.
a
So we have civil
les
society,
universitaires, des organisations
academics,
internationales,
or
le secteur
international
privé.
organizations, the
Et donc,
private
on
sector,
essaye de
and
favoriser la
therefore we
coopération entre
try to
tous ces
promote
acteurs.
cooperation between these
On
sectors.
essaye aussi d'avancer
We also
ensemble
try
vers
to move forwards
l'alignement
together
de nos
towards an
stratégies
alignment of
d'investissement dans
our
la lutte contre le
investment
changement
strategies
climatique, dans
in
la
the fight
préservation
against
de la
climate change.
biodiversité et
We've,
plus
we've
généralement
taken
vers
account
le
of
développement durable.
biodiversity and more specifically into sustainable
Ensuite,
development.
ensemble, on travaille à la
Then together
mobilisation
we
et à
work on
cette
mobilizing
réorientation de tous
and
les flux
reorganizing all
vers
movements
l'agenda 2030
towards
et l'accord de Paris.
the 2030 agenda and the Paris
On a,
Accord.
en tout cas, toutes ces banques publiques de
All
développement, elles
these
ont un rôle
public
très
development banks
particulier
have a
parce
very
qu'elles ont un
specific role
positionnement
because
unique
their
dans
position is unique
l'architecture
in
financière du
the
développement, dans
architecture of
l'architecture
international
financière globale,
financing in a
pour
global
agir
context
comme
to act
originateur de
as the
projets,
originator of projects
comme aussi plateforme de
and
dialogue de
also
politique
as a
publique
platform
et de
for public
mobilisation
policy
du secteur
dialogue and
financier
mobilization
vers
of the
atteindre
financial sector
tous les objectifs de développement durable.
into all sustainable development
Euh,
targets.
Quelques chiffres
To
pour
give
vous
you some
parler
figures,
de leur contribution à la lutte contre le
to talk
changement
about
climatique,
their contribution to the
puisqu'elles
fight
sont
against
de
climate
tailles
change, because
diverses, de
there are
champs
various sizes
géographiques très
and
divers, de
regional scopes as
gouvernances
well, and
diverses,
also
dans le
forms
sens
of governance that
national,
are
régional,
also
multilatéral.
different in
Elles ont
terms of
la
national,
force
bilateral,
de
multilateral
participer
formats.
à la lutte contre
They
le
are
changement
fortunate enough to
climatique.
be able
Et
to
en 2024,
contribute to
par
the struggle
exemple, les
against
banques
climate
multilatérales de
change. In
développement ont atteint un nouveau
2024,
record de
these multinational things
137
had
milliards de dollars dans le
$137
financement climatique,
billion
dont
in
les deux tiers vers
financing
des pays à
climate
faible
change
revenu
measures
et revenu
in countries
intermédiaire.
with
Et
low
les 27
and
membres
intermediary
du
revenue
club
income.
IDFC, donc
Members of the
International Development
ADFC, the
Finance Club en
International
français,
Development and Finance Club,
non, je plaisantais, ont engagé, eux, 200 milliards de dollars en
committed
faveur de la
$200
finance
billion
climatique. Donc, vous voyez, c'est quand
to
même des
finance
volumes
this.
assez
So we're
intéressants.
talking about quite interesting
Et,
levels here.
et elles contribuent déjà
And
largement
once
à l'action
again, it
climatique.
contributes
Un tout
already
petit point
to measures
additionnel
against
pour
climate
parler du
change. An
contexte
additional point to talk
spécifique
about the
africain,
specific
puisque
context
c'est
of
aussi notre
Africa,
sujet du jour.
because this is our
En
subject
Afrique, on a une
today.
centaine
In
de banques publiques de
Africa, we
développement
have 100 development banks.
sur les
In
540 plus. Donc,
of
c'est un nombre
the
assez conséquent.
540 odd. So it's
On
quite a
a une
significant
banque
number.
publique de développement dans
We
au
have a
moins
public development
39
bank in at least
des 54 pays du
39
continent.
of the 54 countries on the continent.
Ensemble, elles totalisent
Together,
211
they
milliards
amount
de dollars
to
d'actifs, dont près
$211
d'un
billion
quart sont
in
détenus par la
assets,
Banque
of which
africaine de
nearly
développement.
a
Donc les
quarter
autres
is
sont plus
held by
petites
the African
en
Development
termes
Bank.
de volume.
The others are
Et
fairly small in
d'après la
terms of
CPI, le
volumes.
Climate
And
Policy
according to
Initiative,
CPI,
les banques
the Climate
multilatérales
Initiative,
sont les
multilateral
principaux
development banks
bailleurs de
are the
fonds pour le
main
climat en
financiers
Afrique. C'est une
for
donnée
climate
assez
change
intéressante sur
in
les
Africa. It's an
43
interesting datum.
milliards de dollars de
Of the
financement
$43
recensés en
billion
Afrique.
in
Les banques
climate financing
multilatérales
in
en ont
Africa,
fourni
multilateral
près de
banks
la moitié.
account
Donc,
for
le
nearly
message
half of
ici,
that.
c'est qu'en tirant
So the message
parti
here
de leur connaissance
is
des
that
marchés
making the most
et
of
des
the market
besoins
knowledge and the
locaux et des
needs
tissus
locally
économiques,
and the local
sociaux et
economic
locaux,
context and
les banques
social
de
context,
développement nationales et
national
régionales
and
ont un
regional development
potentiel
banks have
énorme
a
pour
huge
jouer un rôle beaucoup
potential
plus important dans la
to
lutte contre le
play
changement
a far more
climatique,
important role in the
notamment
fight against climate change, in
en servant de
particular
pont entre
as being
les
used as
marchés
gateways
financiers et les acteurs
between
économiques locaux, les
financial markets
entreprises
and
et
local
les
actors,
collectivités qu'elles
companies
connaissent
and
parfaitement.
local authorities that they know so well.
Le but
The
ultime, je
aim, the
dirais,
ultimate
de
goal
cette action des banques
of
publiques de
this
développement dans l'action climatique, et
action by
particulièrement en
these banks
Afrique,
against climate change,
c'est
especially in Africa, is to
d'accompagner
support
l'atténuation des risques
mitigation
physiques
of physical risks
liés au changement climatique
relating
et
to
d'accompagner
climate
les
change
risques de
and to
transition.
accompany
C'est-à-dire
risks
que le monde va,
relating
et
to
on le
transition.
démontre encore,
The world, and I still believe this,
inéluctablement
is
vers une transition
inevitably
bas
going
carbone.
towards a low
Et
carbon
l'idée,
transition.
c'est d'accompagner
And
les
the
pays
idea is to
africains
support African countries
à être aussi dans cette
to
transition,
be
être un
also
acteur de la
in this
transition, à
transition
ne
and
pas
be an
être
actor in this
laissé de
transition,
côté par les
an
acteurs
agent
majeurs
in
qui
this,
vont
and
conduire
not
la
being
transition,
left aside
de
by
sorte
people,
qu'ils
others in the
puissent
transition, so that they can
continuer, voire
continue
accélérer leur
and even
participation à ces
accelerate their
changements.
contribution to
Pour
that
finir, je
change.
vous rappelle
In
juste
conclusion,
deux
I'd just like to
sommets
remind you that
de
two
la
summit
coalition Finance
meetings
en commun
of the Finance in Common
ont eu lieu en
coalition
Afrique. En
took place
2022,
in
il a été
Africa in
organisé par la
2022.
Banque africaine de développement à
It
Abidjan.
was organized by
Et en
the African
2025,
Development Bank in Abidjan in
il était organisé
2025.
par la
It was held
DBSA, Development
by
Bank
the
of Southern Africa, en
DBSA, the
collaboration
Development Bank
avec
of South
AIIB,
Africa, in conjunction with the
au Cap,
AIIB
en Afrique du Sud.
at the Cape in South Africa.
Voilà, il y a eu des sommets chaque année depuis
There are
2020,
summits
mais deux en
every year
Afrique.
since
Ça démontre quand
2020, but
même
two in Africa, which show
le positionnement des banques africaines
the position
dans
of
le
African
débat
banks
sur le rôle des banques
in
publiques de
the
développement sur
discussion
l'architecture financière
in
internationale.
this,
Et en particulier
and
au
in
Cap,
particular
ça avait lieu
in
en
the
parallèle
Cape,
de la
which
ministérielle
was take place
finance
at the same
du
time
G20
as the
sous
G20
présidence
finance
sud-africaine,
under the
dont les
presidency
thèmes
of
sont
South
solidarité,
Africa,
égalité
with the
et
themes of
durabilité, qui sont
solidarity, equality, and
des
durability,
sujets de banque publique de développement.
which are the subjects for development banks.
Je vais m'arrêter là, mais je reste disponible pour les questions. Merci.
Alors, on collectera les questions.
So we'll be collecting questions at the end of the panel. I will now turn it over to Thomas Rovial. Well, Thomas Rovial, before joining the Treasury, worked also at the BERN, which is the other development bank. And Thomas, maybe in addition to what has been said, he could specify maybe multilateral elements and the respective roles in mitigating and adapting. The floor is yours. Thank you very much. Thank you, the Banque de France, for this webinar. Yes, I will express myself as a shareholder of the MDBSs, you know, the World Bank and the other regional banks involved in development. To come back to what Le Grand said in introduction about the context, certainly we see now a momentum in favor combating climate change since the arrival of the new US administration. You know, it led to a debate which is driven by the US administration more strongly. Maybe the risk of backtracking, though. We succeeded in the past few years collectively to prompt development banks to align all their activities around the Accord of Paris and increase their climate-related finances. So 45% of these fundings be providing benefits for the climate. So there has been progress made. And the action of shareholders, which is absolutely essential And so, therefore, there was some progress that was made that could be put on hold. And France and Europeans will try to avoid that we move backward around the role of the MDBSs regarding climate-related funding. For France and the Europeans, we are not doing this we do this because we feel that it is economically that is also very important. Well, there are contradictions, of course, between growth development on the one hand and combating climate change. There are some overlaps also, combinations at two levels, both on mitigation, reducing greenhouse gases, which we requires deployment of renewables. These are areas where there are huge needs for investments and also are drivers for growth. There are companies that don't have fossil natural resources and being dependent on imports of fossil resources. And we saw this with what happened in Ukraine. It has economic consequences that are direct. So many countries economically have an interest in developing energy sustainable resources and renewables, whether with, Africa, for example, has a huge energy potential in terms of solar energy and wind energy, which are local sources of energy indicated of imports or coming from foreign countries. So it's about energy sovereignty and economic growth, which goes hand in hand with the goal of mitigating and reducing greenhouse effects. And in terms of mitigation that is all the investments that help to improve the resilience of the economy. We see that there's a cost if there's climate non-action. Many countries are subject to the consequences of climate change very directly. There are some droughts that could last years and years that have an impact on agricultural yields, on the agricultural economy and farmers. We see very clearly that in many countries, the consequences are such that we must really invest in mitigation to make sure there's more resilience in the economies and so that they can resist better. And adapting, for example, agriculture, for example, in Morocco, where there was a lot of drought, being able to invest in new processes or in new cultures that are more resistant to climate change. It's not, we don't do this only because of the climate, but also for the well-being and the prosperity and the economic growth of those countries. So it's quite important to remember that when you finance the climate regarding adaptation and mitigation, it ought to be also in the economic interest in the development of countries. All of this implies a lot of investment, high level of investments. At the COP29 last year in Baku, the amount of investments on the whole for developing countries for the climate that are necessary by 2035 is $1,300 billion per year, public and private. That is for low and middle income countries. These are considerable amounts. A large number of these finances come locally or from must be raised through public resources. The MDBSs and the public assistant helpers and providers must normally provide 300 billion per year by 2035. A large part will be provided by the MDBSs, which is the case already. Between 2/3 and 3/4 of climate-related fundings provided in developing countries come from MDBSs, and it will continue to be the case in the next few years. It's a lot around mitigating, but it's a lot also about adapting, because adapting has a larger number of concessionality. You need, it requires more concessional resources, and we mentioned this. These concessional ones are increasingly rare, but anyway, adaptation is key. So the role of MDBS is now, in terms of funding, will be very significant. Now, the role of development banks goes well beyond funding. I noticed this at the Bird Bank, which is starting now this year to start financing the sub-Saharan countries. The role of a development bank is above all to support companies in the definition of their climate-related strategy over the long term so that there's visibility for investors. It's also to support the authorities to put in place a regulatory framework or legislative one so that you can attract investments. And we know this in terms of renewable energy. It implies to have a regulatory framework that provides visibility, a clear framework that enables to attract investments. And in this case, there's technical assistance that can be provided by MDBSs to help governments in in inspiring themselves from the best technical aspects from abroad. I mean, another aspect which is very important is preparing projects. Very often, I noticed this at the Bern. Sometimes finances were available, but projects were not bankable or were not underlined well. So helping the definition of projects so that they can attract investments from multilateral banks, from local banks, from public banks and private investors is also a factor which is very important with the preparation of projects. This is something that public banks may well contribute to. And there's a challenge that development banks can contribute to is structuring country platforms. That is, there are many places, as you said, there are 5 MDBS around the globe. If we include local authorities, public, local companies, and private investment, that's a lot of people involved. So there's a fragmentation in a way of the development actors. There's an interest in being able to have a global strategy, which will be defined by the country. It has to be the local authorities that are at the helm and able to set a clear strategy when it comes to decarbonation, and able then to bring together all the stakeholders with an organization of the work with its support in terms of financing, technical assistance. There are examples which I believe were quite efficient, which enable to build up on what Laurent Criller said before. If there's a debate between is it better to tap into fossil countries in the countries or develop renewables? Well, the example of Egypt with the country platforms they have there, which involve not only energy, but agriculture, water, transportation as well. The country had defined a very clear strategy. They produce gas, by the way, and the country understood well their interest was to tap into the gas for their own consumption, but also export gas and also benefit from the natural resources, the solar ones, which are significant in the country, and develop renewables, which today are very competitive. So in many countries, the cheapest energy is not the fossil one, it's the renewable energy. Of course, it's more capital intensive, but in terms of exploiting it, the energy is very profitable because technological progress have been considerable in the past few years. Now, strictly economically, in Egypt, it made sense to have an investment plan to develop massively the solar and wind energies and save the consumption of gas, so then you can export it and have export-related resources. If there's an economy that is, the economy was on a win-win basis, so it supports things locally, but it reduces also the greenhouse effects and also the power and the depends on electricity. So there are some strategies, therefore, which are on a win-win basis defined by the country, involving every economic stakeholder. It's the case of the private sector, the public sector, of the multilateral development agencies. This could work. There are examples such as this. As shareholders, we ask, DBSs to work better together and develop these different aspects, technical aspects, financing, bringing together all the stakeholders. There's also the question of innovation in terms of investment to mobilize more private investments. So there are many initiatives in the going on.
Merci beaucoup, Thomas,
Thank you very much, Thomas,
toutes ces illustrations.
for all
particulier
these
la deuxième
examples,
illusion,
especially the
et
one
puis ce
on
point-là
Egypt
sur
and the
l'innovation, et
point
effectivement,
on innovation.
creuser peut-être,
So we might
rentrer un petit peu
dig
plus dans le
deeper
détail.
into
Donc,
this.
on a eu deux premières
We had
présentations
two
qui étaient,
first
sur, le
presentations
cadre un
that
peu,
were about
général,
the overall framework,
multilatéral. Donc,
like
on va rentrer
multinational,
maintenant
multilateral. Now let's
au niveau local. Alors
drill
là, c'est un
into
niveau
the local
régional,
aspects,
pour le
the
moment,
regional
Monsieur Mouclou.
ones. And
Alors
Mr.
peut-être,
Moklou,
on va profiter justement de
let's
votre
take
présence, puisque vous
advantage
êtes
of
à la
your
fois
presence here. You are both
un membre de la
a member
Banque ouest-africaine de
of the
développement, mais aussi FERDI.
Western Bank of
qui va nous permettre
African
peut-être, d'en savoir plus aussi
Development
sur,
Bank. And
un
so we
des points
might
qui a été
learn more
mis en
about one
avant aussi
point
dans
that
les
was highlighted
précédentes,
in the previous
présentations, qui est celui de
presentations, which is
l'importance de la
about the
coordination
importance
des
of the
actions.
coordination
Donc je vous
of
cède la
action.
parole
So
sans plus attendre.
I turn it over without any further ado to you.
Je vous remercie.
Thank you very much.
Alors, je vous apporte les salutations du président
So,
Serge Ekwe,
our President Serge
qui est
Ekwe
à la fois
is
président de la
saluting
BOAD
you. He is the BOAD
BDFC.
chairman of the
Alors,
BDFC.
la BOAD,
The
c'est
BOAD
la Banque ouest-africaine de
is a
développement,
bank,
qui se trouve
the
au
Western
niveau du
Bank
Togo,
of
qui
Development,
recouvre
located in
beaucoup
Togo and expands
de
over
l'UOMOA.
8 countries of the UI.
Et nous travaillons
And
plus
we
de 2 ans
work,
maintenant
we've been
pour le
working
développement de
towards the
cette
development of that region. We finance public and we have public and private investments. So we play a leading role in regard to the climate and developing the IMOA region.
Il faudrait comprendre que nous sommes
Understand
partis
that we
d'une
started
banque
off from a
vraiment qui
bank
était
that
qui avait
truly
un capital assez
had
soutenu, qui était suffisant selon les moyens
enough equity,
et
but
les
not enough
besoins
equity
de
based on
notre
the
zone.
needs of
Alors,
our
notre plan
region.
stratégique
So as strategic plan for 2022-2025 allowed us to work.
à doubler notre capital.
Well, it doubled
Donc,
our equity, our
aujourd'hui, nous avons
capital.
doublé
So
notre
today
capital,
we
nous avons
doubled our
plus de
capital. We have
possibilités, plus de
more cash
marge vraiment
and more
à financer les
margin and
projets
more
dont nous avons
leeway to
besoin
finance the
dans
projects
notre
we
zone.
need to implement.
Ceci dit,
Having said that,
nous ne séparons pas
we are not
le climat et
separating the
développement.
climate and the
Pour
development
nous,
aspects.
vraiment,
To us,
c'est le même sujet.
it is the same
Au
theme.
tout début d'un
At the
projet,
very beginning of a project,
nous commençons avec
we
l'évaluation
start
environnementale,
with the assessment
sans
of the
ne démarrer
environment,
pas
without
l'exécution
which
du
we do
projet.
not start
Et
a
suite à
project.
cela, maintenant,
Following
nous regardons
that,
effectivement les autres
now,
aspects,
and we
les
look
questions
at the other aspects, the
financiers, les
financial
ressorts qui s'en suivent.
aspects, and so on and
Ceci
so
nous a
forth.
permis de
This
comprendre
has
une
enabled us to
chose, c'est
understand
que l'aspect
something.
climatique également
The
doit
climate
être au
aspect
tout début
has to be at the
de
very
nos
end,
procédures,
at the very start, rather,
notamment avec
of our
l'environnement.
procedure,
Donc,
especially with
nous avons
regard to
mis
the environment.
en
So
place
we
un
put in
département qui est
place
aujourd'hui
a
très
department
efficace et
which is
qui
very
lutte
efficient today
beaucoup sur
and works a
tout ce qui
great
est
deal
climat
on
et l'intégration du
climate
climat dans les
aspects
opérations de la
and
BOAD.
mitigating
Et nous
the
avons
climate.
également compris que
Likewise, we
nous ne pouvons
understood
pas le faire
that we cannot
avec nos
do this
ressources seules.
with our own
Et donc,
resources
depuis
only. So, since
2011, qui
2011,
ont été renouvelés,
with
nous sommes
accreditations that have
accrédités
been renewed,
auprès
we have been
des fonds
accredited
climat, les fonds
to
qui
the
sont
climate
les fonds
funds,
exigés au niveau de
which
la
are
Convention cadre des Nations Unies sur le changement
which are
climatique,
part of the United
notamment le fonds
Nations Fund,
d'adaptation, le
especially
fonds pour
the
l'environnement
Adaptation
mondial, le fonds
Fund
vert pour le climat.
and the
Et
Climate Green
à
Fund.
travers ces
And
accréditations, nous
through
avons
these
mobilisé plus de 500
accreditations,
millions de dollars
we
aujourd'hui,
obtain more than $500
avec
million
lesquels nous faisons du crédit,
with which
qui nous permet aujourd'hui de faire
we
face
can
effectivement
face
à tous ces challenges-là
all
que
these
les
challenges
pays dans lesquels nous
that the
intervenons
countries in which we
ont.
step in
Et en
are
parlant
faced.
d'innovation,
Talking about
nous avons
innovation,
également pensé à
we
des
also
instruments,
thought about
notamment aujourd'hui nous
instruments,
avons
especially today.
développé
We've
un produit
developed
avec
a
l'appui de
product with the
notre
support
partenaire
one
Banque de
of our
le produit
partner,
sur le produit adapté
especially
aux catastrophes
with regard to NatCat or natural catastrophes, which enables us to ensure to service the debt if there's a climate related shock in one of those countries. It is quite an innovative instrument for us and enables us as well to provide some relief to those states if there's a climate damage, if it occurs. Apart from this, today, in terms of, we have an innovation department that works on issues related to innovation. We try to include innovation in every operation today. And so we encourage, and we are following the right trajectory, I believe. We also understood that since the last FFD fund, well, the financial architecture is effective only if the decision is close to the reality of execution. We understood that our role is not only to have a public bank mandate, and to execute, but we have to be working with the ecosystem that is already existing. This IDFC has 27 development plans. The last one to join us is we are very proud of it, and we work together with all the members in order to align our operations around the Paris Accord and make sure that all our members have the ability to implement projects that are highly aligned around the Paris Accord and around other audits. So within this, we have a climate facility that enables us to provide technical assistance in originating projects, in developing projects, and also provide or share our experiences and rely on the experiences of others to really be able to mobilize more concessionals that we need today. So this is the role that we are playing today. This is our positioning when it comes to the BOAD, and I think that our next strategic plan, for it, we want to improve what we've done so far. We want to do more, and we are very open to this idea of partnership and of working with others. And by the way, this is an opportunity to speak also of the investment forum that the IDFC is organizing through its working group on cooperation for development. And the aim for us is to encourage co-financing, bearing.
So for this market, it's not entirely that clear, nor to be able to get the resources, especially given the resources today. And of course, through very innovative margins, we have that ability to mobilize. We recently we raised, in fact, €1 billion with a 15-year maturity date, which no bank in Africa has ever been able to do before. We managed this. We did this in dollars over 10 years. We were the first to do it over 15 years, and we'll use all these resources to support our states. Thank you. Thank you very much. Yes, we'll go into the crux of the matter with some instruments that are used. And let's go down now onto the field, so to speak, with our last two speakers. The first is Mr. Bensouda, who's Director General of the Moroccan Caisse de Dépôt. I'll hand the floor over to you, sir, to give us some examples of what's been done. Thank you for your invitation. And through these things, I also like to thank Banque de France and the FERDI. I'm not the director. I am General Counsel of the Caisse de Dépôt. Before talking in concrete terms of what the Caisse de dépôt does with its vertical approach in development. It also has horizontal things in its activities. I want to point out a point, if you don't mind. The first is, as we're talking about Africa, of course, I agree with all the remarks made by my predecessors here. Africa, in terms of continent, is behind 2 to 3% of emissions, but the impact it incurs and the shocks and the crises are quite frequent. Extreme drought. My colleague here talked about agriculture with yields that are quite cyclical. All this should make us think. There's another, on the other side, a paradox that could be pointed out as we are talking about the mobilization of means and financing.
Je viens de Casablanca. Hier,
I've come from Casablanca. Yesterday, there was a
conference
conference
qui abordait un thème assez
that addressed a fairly global theme,
Finance Summit.
the Africa Finance Summit,
Et le thème, c'était
and the
thème de
theme
souveraineté
was
financière.
of financial sovereignty,
Été le message qui était partagé.
or at least that was the message that was shared.
En Afrique.
There are quite a lot of banks present in Africa.
Les derniers rapports de la Banque
According to the latest African Development Bank, we're talking about $500 billion each year created, but only 10% that's actually invested in the continent itself.
Ça veut dire qu'il y a un certain nombre
In other words,
de
there's a number
trajectoires
of
à faire
trajectories
pour
to
permettre,
follow to enable
de drainer ces investissements-là de manière globale,
make it possible to use these investments for the well-being of local populations. But of course, as my colleague said, development has to be combined and combined with climate. These are things that should be done in parallel and to enable the private sector to be involved in an efficient way. Now, of course, multilateral development banks have a role to play in support that is clear, but it is insufficient because the path is a long one. The figures that were mentioned are eloquent. I would share with you perhaps a figure in recent years. Just in energy, there's the need for practically $100 billion to be invested. Today, Africa can only generate half of that. And if we look at the theme of green financing, climate financing, multilateral banks offer a lot of financing, but the combination with its own needs, and one of our colleagues talked about the budget capacity that remains sufficiently weak. So we have to find these bridges to attenuate, to therefore ensure that we can get there into the mechanisms. I had an obligation to make these points that are reality for us before we start talking about Morocco. One example in Morocco, it's true that in recent years we have gone through and we are continuing to experience a significant drought. But this has made it possible for all bodies and authorities and His Majesty the King and de l'Assis to look in several speeches to include sustainable development as one of our national priorities. As for the energy mix, and we have a very strong target of getting more than half of our energy mix from renewable energy sources by 2030. At the moment, we're at about 37%. What we've experienced in recent years has made it possible to launch a number of programs or sector issues to ensure a balance between our regions and also make it possible to commit significant portable investment for this for Morocco over 2024-2027. When I'm talking about investment, it's not just public investment, there's a growing engineering structure. We've got PPPs, we've got financing, hybridization to ensure that the state's budget maintains a number of fundamentals to keep the rating that we still have, but also to ensure this combination of the channeling of savings into opportunities for a national level PPP financing. A number of instruments are there in this. Over the short term, we will talk about water that we financed because there were catchment areas that were very important both for irrigation and for drinking water. We needed a motorway. We had to put motorways to make sure that we could get to basins or catchment areas where there was this deficit. Second factor, resume on His Majesty's instruction the construction of dams, a significant effort made, therefore, to put desalination stations, and they were investing enormously. We have two coastlines, but above all, the Atlantic coastline, that make it possible to invest enormously in desalination plants. And as my colleague said, we have solar and wind power, so we have desalination stations with clean energy, which can reduce the cost price per cubic meter and can therefore help agriculture and drinking water. And these are examples, but my message when I'm talking about these two is one of resilience and to consider a crisis that may occur in climate terms as being a factor to develop a development plan integrated and that can meet over time current stakes and future ones. That is the direction of our priorities in our country, in all our actions. So, moving on now to the Caisse de dépôt de gestion. I won't present it globally. It's like quite a lot like the CDC in France and in the ADFC as well, of which we are members with colleagues. There is a forum for development banks, and it helps to create this kind of instrument in Africa. Why is this important? Because in reality, it makes it possible to create a bridge in some way between what I'll say a long, lengthy time frame for investment and to collect short-term savings from our populations that could come from a number of legal professions. So put them together and align that twofold effect, ensure security, and transform it turn it into useful jobs, development in the broad sense of the word, infrastructure, everything that we are looking at, water, renewable energy, mobility, clean mobility. These are issues that can and are naturally be in this model. And for us, the Caisse de dépôt de gestion, our action has a twofold approach, but there is a common thread, which is which is the country's agenda, the major priorities there. We're there, not just there for the short term. We're there, in fact, for a number of approaches. Now, this equates quite naturally to the mission or strategy of my institution. I'll begin with the vertical, the most natural, the most original part. In other words, mobilizing resources, and these are resources that can come from retirement, pension funds, insurance companies, or legal professions as well, because there again, where there are business transactions, you need a third party to secure this. all these transactions, the time it takes for them to be implemented. That also means popular savings as well from the post office network. These are small-scale investors that end up in my institution or even actually manage outside the balance sheet through public mandates. Our mission or our missions are to make that saving safe and make it profitable. That's the initial basic mission we had. But the Caisse de dépôt actually channels a number of, quite a large number of significant amounts, which will ensure profitability, but it also is an institution that supports development. And that's the development pillar, the domestic development pillar of our activity. We call it the impact pillar because behind this impact term, which can be quite communicative, but actually it's what drives our actions. In other words, have a positive impact on the country, on citizens, and the economy. All of this, in reality, can be seen and can include a number of themes: food sovereignty, water, energy sovereignty, and so on and so forth. And in an institution such as mine, it's a financial institution. Its basic thing is just to do what? Is basically an exercise of allocating resources. We are basically asset managers, large ones. I'll say so. That's not what others will necessarily say, but a savings bank that actually turns this into profitability, including for climate financing. Well, basically what it's doing is asset allocation in a useful manner and in a fair manner by measuring risks and also with the ability and somewhere the clout to take a commitment over the long term. In reality, it doesn't just finance. The role of institutions such as mine or for development banks is to ensure financing of these things. That's the bridge we build. That's one of the messages that I would like to convey. Now, in concrete terms, in recent years, in reality, I'm saying what we are in the process of doing, but I talked about a stress test. We structured the financing required for water motorways, but it wasn't just enough to structure because that's just consulting. We also had to finance in as well. And the best way of doing so to be able to ensure this is to be the structuring party, to apply that approach and ensure that the biggest amount into financing. It's a factor of trust that is given to partners. Secondly, because we're talking about the energy transition and we are investing enormously in this, both in green energy and in desalination, a large group, public group, Moroccan, which I won't name, but works in phosphate and is actually developing its own desalination plants for its own needs, as it's in locations which they know over the short term, and they know that they are going through some hydric stresses, water stress, will offer the financing required to create to create that driver effect. When I'm talking about financing, I'm not talking about instruments. It could be a bit of long-term debt. It could be equity. It could be some form of securitization. But the point is to have that leverage effect to be able to ensure other people's confidence, especially those turning up in any particular the private sector, and create, therefore, this effect of demonstration or training. And I also want to point out support as well. I can go back to this if there are any questions afterwards about examples that are more concrete. But we've also wished to create an SO. It's a service and engineering firm. It's a subsidiary of our institution. Our point is to support public institutions and regional authorities with a global offer for consulting, engineering, and financial structuring to work on, I'll say, well, okay, something concrete, public lighting. We know that each dirham saved makes it also possible to address other issues that may concern the community. These are examples that are concrete, but over and beyond that, we are an institution that, in its strategy for 2030, has put these issues for sustainable development, for climate financing, as our priorities, not just in terms of posture, but in concrete terms, in terms of costing and allocation. Because firstly, we are utterly convinced of this, and secondly, it's an obligation for an institution such as a sovereign one. It's also a responsibility for today's generations and for the future generations, and that's how we do act, and we wish to continue acting. We're not doing this on our own, because on our own we'll never get there. We're doing this as a community. That desire to act in a community is clearly to be applied throughout the continent, because when we can see that a number of issues are not, or a number of projects are not financed because they're too small individually, they have to attain critical mass. This is the logic, the rationale that should be applied through these mechanisms. My colleague as well, I'm borrowing a lot of what you said, because that rationale of a platform can have an important role to play on a national level, but also at a regional level, that make it possible to have good governance, make it possible to finance a number of things, but also to talk those who can be there, institutionals, financiers, private sector, and address projects to make them profitable. Because behind these issues, when we talk about adaptation or attenuation, some of them are not profitable, but over the short term, others are. But the combination of both make it possible to achieve the ultimate objective. That's what I wanted to share with you, and of course, I'm available if there are any other questions. Thereafter. Well, thank you very much, in particular for emphasizing the idea of the exercise of allocation and the difficulties, and we'll go back to this later. It's not the imbalance between savings and investment, it's more a question of mobilizing savings for investment needs. And we'll end up with you, we'll conclude with you. You represent the Rwanda Development Bank. You can give your own outlook and perhaps insist on your actions and the way you can combine these different sources of financing and the challenges you meet in the field.
Thank you for inviting us to be part of this fascinating conversation. I'd like to thank you for your invitation. Whether we have multinational or regional banks, they are part of the same ecosystem, DG Mirio. Well, we all have the same DNA. This is true. This is why there are many similarities in the presentations made by the various speakers. Public national development banks have something special. They have a poor reputation, especially in Africa. The reality is that the national development banks, for the public ones that have a different caliber, if they survive 1990, if you look at the financial status of our Rwandan bank, you will be surprised to have non-performing loans of -2%, leverage effects of 1 to 4. For equity to debt ratios, you will see that we can raise funds, consumer funds, but most of them are funds that come from other development banks. This is why I insist to say that we are part of the same ecosystem. Our main financiers are the World Bank, KWV, the African Development Plan, the AFD, of course, and many other development banks. So we operate in the same ecosystem. We perform slightly different roles. However, it's about time that we look once again at the public development national banks and look at those that remain, what they're like. I would like to share the testimonial of our Rwandan bank so that is clear. Yes, Africa is highly impacted by the climate, but it's also clear, as my Moroccan colleague said, that solutions already exist on the continent, and Africa is not waiting for a hand for solutions coming from elsewhere. So all the interventions that were made in the continent are based on development problems. It's important to, so the BOAD has shared this, but any climate solution that doesn't address a development issue will fail. So it's important. I will give you, as part of Rwanda, we have moved from 4% of access to electricity in 2003 to more than 75% in 2025. And this based on solar solutions or hydro solutions, therefore, solutions which are in favor of the climate. When I speak to my clients at the bank, they're not interested in the climate. What they want is to have light at home. So our role as public agents is to ensure that we provide them access to light, but with sustainable solutions. If we give them access to little light without a sustainable sustainability, these solutions will not be accepted by the population. So I think it's important to consider that. The figures that were outlined are very clear. The need for investment is huge. And the way we see this in Rwanda is that we will not manage with additional financing, but with the new global dynamics, whether coming from the US or developed countries and the tax space, we won't manage. So the major innovation provided by our Rwandan Development Bank on our market is that when we issued our first local currency bond, one of the goals we had was to help the rest of the financial sector in adopting the good practices in terms of environment and social risks. So you will see it if you look at the website. One of the indicators is 75% of our clients, which are financial institutions in Rwanda, must practice the best practices when it comes to environment-related risk and the social risks. So it's a bit using national development banks not only as links for the money and knowledge, but also influence and convert existing institutions into adopting the climate-related agenda. I think there's far more impact if we don't do some navel gazing, of course. So we look at our own portfolio, reach 30% of our portfolio related to climate by 2028. But if you look at 30% of our, for us, will not move the needle very much. So it looks good on the website, but if I really look practically at the effects when it comes to the population, it's not adequate enough. So we need to play a different role. And the role of national development banks is truly to play that role as a financial leverage, but also a leverage when it comes to influence the whole ecosystem. Fortunately, in Rwanda, we have huge contribution from the National Rwanda Bank, which is our central bank. So I was pleased to see that the invitation came from the Banque de France, because I think there's a huge role that could be also played by national banks or the central banks to influence the financial system in the countries. There's a partnership that is necessary, a twinning between national development banks and the central banks. Now, by providing our experience, we create a national platform around a fund related to the climate, dedicated only to the private sector. And our experience is that it's far easier on PowerPoint that in the reality of things. Why is that the case? Everyone talks about national platforms, which is very exciting for everyone. That's the key word when you attend AGMs. So what was our experience? Well, when you create a national platform, in general, the partners are highly enthused at the idea of having national goals and a political national policy. Once you have to agree on the allocation of resources, it becomes trickier. The selection criteria of what is green, if I take the example of European countries, they have different criteria, different from among the various institutions. For my client, what does it look like? How to know if that client is eligible to the national platform for the green financing? Then it becomes tough. Of course, generally, these criteria have a political and economic element. When we talk about national platforms, you need to be honest and say, hey, if you really want to invest in national platforms to combat climate change, especially in Africa, there's not a lot of capacity institution-wise. We would have to have common global criteria. Same thing for access to climate funds. So BRD was lucky through a lot of work to become eligible and accredited to the climate global fund. But if we want to have access to other funds related to the climate, it's different criteria again. So it's a whole momentum to become eligible again. So therefore, as mentioned, our colleague from the Treasury Department, yes, funds are, the concessional funds become increasingly scarce, but there's a possibility to use them better. Starting to trust national platforms and starting to have common criteria for eligibility to all these green global funds, and also thinking about strengthening the capabilities through sector-based experiments. I often say that we have a lot of technical assistance for strategy, but very little to discuss the technologies that actually work on the ground. And for my clients, they do not loan money based on national strategies. They want to know if they are in the transition to mobility, if you are a client, if they have diesel buses, if they move to green buses. They want to know in Rwanda what works. For example, we conducted an experiment and only Bogota buses that work in the hills. All the other buses don't work on our hills. So these are the discussions that are necessary, and where technological knowledge needs to be imparted, not only knowledge about macronational policies. If you want to have a green transition in Africa, that will be benefiting the population. Now, the last point that I would like to add with regard to the cost of financing, we talk very little about it. I think it's a huge challenge. Let me share an example with you. We carried out innovation trust with the World Bank, where they gave us a guarantee. They loaned us money to have a guarantee for a bond for the BRD, for funding, for sustainable funding. The reason why we're able to structure this, engineer this with $1 of the World Bank, we raised $3 in terms of national savings, and even with low-income countries have national savings that can be mustered, because the price of that initial dollar was affordable. Once it is not affordable, then even the mechanisms that are seen now as innovative, such as collaterals and so on, do not work, because I cannot sell a product as a bank to a private consumer or a borrower that will cost more because it's green. And I think we rarely speak about the problem of the cost of green financing. When we start our major adventure at the BRD, at our development Rwandan Bank to contribute to combating climate change. We didn't expect those prices in the market. We started with major ambitions, and they were not able to materialize because the price was just not a price that enabled us to move this financing to the private sector. For a long time, the public financing was designed for governments, and now that we see that the private sector in Africa ought to be at the center of discussions, it is about time that we rediscuss the price or the cost of such funding so that they are spurring financing from the private sector. So it requires initially a large amount of capital, so the initial cost is quite high, which often is not attractive for the private sector. So I wanted to share with you the challenges, and my Moroccan colleague, I think, made a great presentation about opportunities, so I didn't want to repeat what he just said. I just wanted to share with you an idea about the challenges that we see on the ground when it comes to doing more scaling for green financing. Thank you. Thank you very much. Let me build on your last 2 points. That way we can come back to questions before we open the floor for questions. There are several of you who have raised that question about allocating resources. You say that there are some resources that are available even locally, but then the difficulty is to raise further because it could be a question of size or timeline. Or conviction. So I'd like to come back a bit to this. You also, something that you have expanded a lot, but open up things about the criteria. Most of you have also been drawing a parallel with the fact that there was a huge complementarity between climate and development, stressing the well-being of the populations. So the question of transition was popped up. The first question is about this. So in other words, what are the criteria that you use? Qualitative or quantitative criteria? What are the kind of concrete criteria you use to direct or channel such financings at different levels, multinationals, local or regional levels? Because there are other questions that are also very interesting in what you raised, which is sovereignty, national sovereignty. In other words, there are goals which are not necessarily shared, which are specific to or fairly the same everywhere when it comes to development. So that's my first question. My second question, which you also raised, is that the hindrances, especially of financial obstacles, such as the cost issue, there's an issue of regulations, because there are some obstacles that are related to the regulations that impede development. There's another difficulty that you also raised, which is mobilizing private capital. Certainly, several of you gave examples about leverage, which are fairly connected and encouraging. At the same time, we noticed that, I think you mentioned this in terms of lending, blended finance. This is part of innovation, but it's not being developed very much. So what are the obstacles that account for this insufficiency in terms of development? Are these regulatory criteria? Is it due to the cost? Are collaterals not sufficient? These are the questions around which I wanted you to maybe intervene. Let's start perhaps with the one who wants to be first, and then we'll just see how it goes.
Au niveau des interventions, nous avons
now, in terms of operation, we have criteria per project that enables us to see whether a project contributes either to mitigation or to adaptation. have what is very difficult. It's very difficult to finance adaptation projects with nearly commercial interest rates. So most projects are about mitigation. The project has to be bankable, as we say, and sometimes bankable may mean many things. It could be bankable in terms of the market, the daily market, or we also saw opportunities through donations from the World Bank to use funds to create a market. Let me share an example. When we started the adventure of solar panels, the population did not understand. Well, there was a problem with a change in behavior, which was problematic. So the population did not want these solar panels because for them, electricity came from the electricity power department. So we had to create a market starting with the poorest ones to enable them to have access to solar panels. This is an example where the criterion is not necessary for a market that exists, but the criterion is a national policy that was very clear or not clear. Through this program, we were able to connect about 500,000 inhabitants that helped us to reach our national goal. So sometimes the word bankable is misleading. In that case, we created a market through a product that was a concessional one. We also obviously look at the sustainability of our operation as a development bank. Is such investment enabling results that are sustainable over time? It's very important because we do not support the operations that could stop all of a sudden or do not have a long-term impact for the population. And with all of this, it allows us to see the kind of timeline we did, what are the interest rates, should we do it in 1, 2, or 3 stages? Do we need cooperation with other state-owned agency? And one of the strengths of the public development banks, which is not mentioned very often, is their ability to have access to state entities. And we see many clients that come from areas that are less sexy than others, such as the access to low housing rents or urban planning, which is not easy in Africa. They speak to us not necessarily because we have much lower interest rates than commercial banks, but they know what they will be doing has a transformation effect and requires cooperation with state bodies. We should not underestimate these capabilities, which are within national development banks. And thirdly, in our case, thanks to our partnership with the AFD, we have a verification system that is independent, that enables us to ensure that projects do not become greenwashing. It's very important for us in terms of reputation, integrity, and so we want to have an independent capacity about the project at the outset and ex post to ensure that all these projects that were financed do not end as a scandal or hurting our reputation. All these capabilities are important institutionally and are criteria for us. So if the client does not agree to be subject to such assessment, then they do not have access to investments. These are criteria which are very tangible when it comes to projects and clients. And now, in terms of financing, we had to be a bit strict, so created criteria in terms of the bank, the Rwanda Development Bank, for all our partners. And in terms of the national platform, we said, take it or leave it. And some partners could not adjust, so we tried other partners. They took up the challenge, and they fought a bit with their own credit committee or the internal committee. And the AFD was the first one, and I thank Remy Rayo for this. We told them, if the AFD can do it, why cannot you do it? So it was an example. It's very important that we have our own criteria. Our criteria for fund are called IDB in our national language. It's about quality of.
This became the precursor of the taxonomy. So we started with that in 2022, and in 2025, the Council of Ministers approved the first Rwandan taxonomy. Now, we're very proud of this because we started off with an adventure in institutional terms without being entirely sure what would happen, and it became a relational and national investment framework. And for the next cycle, the program will use the national taxonomy. I'd like to hand over to Thomas, who has a little time constraint, I think. As for the question of expenses, I think it's very interesting because and quite fair to say this. There's the issue of the administrative ability in terms of, in local terms, to be able to originate and manage projects. So there is a role for public institutions, be it national or multilateral, to help the structuring of projects. There was also the issue of mobilizing local savings, and that's a point that's also come back on multiple occasions. I understood that local savings could be important, but not necessarily focused on investors at local level. So there are multiple initiatives taken for multinational development banks to try more and more finance and even use local currency to structure and add density on a liquid local market. Now, that's a challenge in everywhere, including in Europe, to extend and increase the density of financial markets. So that's also a development issue. There's also support over and beyond the banking sector to go to financial markets, to make them more functional and focus savings on investment needs for development. So those are 2 points, those 2 obstacles, shall we say, 2 extra points, 2 levers that can be used to see it for the massive investment requirement.
Comme l'AFD a été cité, et puis ensuite je vous passe la parole.
Merci beaucoup. Merci.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Merci. Avant de commencer, je voulais rebondir
Before beginning,
sur
I just want to react
de Campeta sur les solutions locales.
The idea about local solutions.
Je l'ai dit et
I've said
j'espère
so, and I hope
bien dit, les banques
that I made it very clear that national development banks have that capacity
faire levier sur les solutions nationales.
to actually do this for the
particulièrement en matière de lutte
national
contre le changement
SOSs,
climatique,
especially
des
for
solutions en Afrique, il y a plein de
for climate
potentiel, il y
change
a plein
measures. There's
d'idées,
lots of
et il se
potential,
passe
lots of
plein de
ideas,
choses,
and
et
lots of
c'est
things are
aussi
happening.
le rôle des
And
banques
that's
qui
the
sont tout
role
près
of
des
banks
solutions,
that are very close to
de
solutions
les valoriser.
to
Je
ensure
voulais
their
contribuer
value.
sur
Now,
l'un
I
des
wanted to
freins
talk about one of the
qui
obstacles that
parfois, vous
sometimes,
l'avez dit également,
as you said,
le rôle d'une banque publique de développement,
the role of a public development bank is to direct or redirect the client's demand,
fait la demande d'avoir
because
de la lumière chez lui et à nous
all they want is
une
some
solution
insights, and it's up to us to provide a
alignée
solution
avec les
aligned
enjeux
with
finaux.
the
Mais
climate
parfois,
challenges. But sometimes
il y a des enjeux plus politiques
there
quand
are
on
more
s'engage dans un
political
dialogue de
stakes
politique
when you're
publique. Et
committed
par exemple, en
to
Afrique du
public policy,
Sud,
for
où
example, in
j'étais
South
juste
Africa,
avant,
where I'd been before,
l'enjeu de la sortie du charbon
the
rencontre
challenge
le
of
frein
withdrawing
de
from a
l'adhésion
carbon
peut-être de la
system
population qui
may be opposed by the
n'a
local
pas
populace
forcément les
that
considérations
doesn't necessarily have the same
globales et
climate
qui se dit
considerations in
mais
global
enfin
terms, and then
pourquoi
they
ça
say,
marche très
well, why?
bien
It works fine.
et dans une considération de court terme, ça
And
fonctionne.
over a short
Donc, je pense
term,
que l'un des
it
freins
works.
aussi
So
dans
one
l'engagement
of
de
the
transition, c'est
obstacles for that
une adhésion populaire.
transition is
Et
buy-in
en Afrique
by
du Sud, plus précisément,
people.
le
And in
président a
South Africa,
porté le
more
sujet de la
specifically, the
transition
president
énergétique
talked about the
juste
issue of
comme un
the
projet
energy
politique pour
transition just
réconcilier
as
l'agenda global
a
de
policy
transition bas
issue,
carbone
to talk
et
about the
l'agenda
low carbon thing
domestique
and
de
to talk about
lutte
the domestic
contre
agenda of measures
la
against
pauvreté, le chômage et les
poverty,
inégalités qui est
unemployment,
le
and
triptyque
inequality, which is
perdant en Afrique du Sud.
the losing triptych or trio in
Cette
Southern Africa.
transition,
That transition
elle a consisté à
consisted
créer le cercle
of
vertueux.
creating a virtuous circle.
C'est-à-dire
In other words,
développer des politiques
developing
inclusives dans
inclusive
lesquelles
policies
chacun
in
devait
which
trouver sa place
everyone has
et
a place,
qui, en retour, ont
and in
légitimé
return,
et aidé à porter le
justified
projet
and
et
carried
il
the
y a eu un
project
enclenchement. Voilà.
and,
Donc,
and made it carry
parfois,
on.
il y
So
a ce type de
sometimes
frein et
there's
parfois, il y
that
a des
kind
cercles vertueux qui
of
s'enclenchent
obstacle, but also
sur la
sometimes a
thématique
virtuous
développement
circle
climat
in the
qui vont
terms
se
of
nourrir
climate
l'un l'autre.
development.
Merci.
Mr. Bensoudan.
En fait, on est pratiquement dans le mot de la fin.
We're almost at the conclusion. No. Okay.
Ah, très bien. En réalité, moi, je voulais peut-être ajouter un
I
point.
wanted to add a point, which is
Il y a un rôle aussi qui peut être
there's a role that can
donné
be
aux investisseurs institutionnels.
given to institutional
Aujourd'hui, nous
investors,
parlons
because
plus
today we are talking
les
more
banques de
about
développement, les
development
banques
banks,
multilatérales,
multilateral
financent
banks,
des projets.
financing projects.
Peut-être que je vais,
Perhaps
dans une autre vie, j'étais dans
in
le
another
marché,
life,
donc,
I
je
used to
sais
work
quel est
in
le
markets,
regard que
and
peut avoir
I know what kind
un
of take
investisseur.
an
Je le
investor
suis
can have,
par ma fonction actuelle.
and
Si
also through
demain,
my own current position.
on travaillait
If
pour
tomorrow we
faire
started
des
working
banques de
to
développement,
ensure
une classe
to create
d'actifs part
development banks
entière
with
qui
asset
permet
classes that are on
aux
their own,
investisseurs
would make
institutionnels
it possible for institutional
d'investir.
investors to invest.
Un travail formidable, il est fait localement, il
Fantastic
est fait
work. It's done
régionalement, il
locally.
est
It's
fait sur le plan
done.
multilatéral,
It's done on a
mais c'est
multilateral
aussi un moyen
level, but it also means to
de drainer,
ensure
d'intéresser un certain nombre
to
de gérants
interest a
mondiaux,
number of
centaines de milliards de
global
dirhams, voire des trillions
asset managers
de
that
dollars
are
vers ces
managing
classes.
billions, if not trillions of
Alors cela
dollars,
suppose
and that means
plusieurs
that
choses. Mais c'est
there are
aussi
several
une
things. There are
trajectoire
several.
qu'il faut
It's a
commencer,
trajectory that
à
we
mon
have to
sens,
start,
à préparer.
I believe, to prepare
De la gouvernance, de
governance,
la transparence.
transparency.
On est dans les locaux de la Banque de France et on sait
We're in
très
the
bien
premises
que
of
les
the Banque de
régulateurs
France, and we are here with
font un
the
travail
regulator.
formidable
We know they do a fantastic
sur
job
les normes, sur les reporting,
on norms and
IFRS,
reporting,
Bâle 3,
IFRS,
un certain nombre de
Basel
sujets.
III, and
Ce
a
sont
number
des
of issues.
langages communs qui
This
permettent
is a common
à tous
language that makes it
de
possible
parler de
for
la même
everyone
chose
to talk
et
about
de
the
lire
same
la
thing
même chose.
and to
Donc,
read
ces
the same
reporting, ces
thing.
frameworks
This
qui sont communs
reporting, these frameworks that are shared,
permettent aussi
also make it
d'identifier et
possible to
permettre d'avoir
identify
cette classe d'actifs qui
that
pourrait
kind
être
of
demain
asset
une
class
classe
that
d'actifs qui
could
peut
be
être regardée,
tomorrow,
qui
that
peut
could be
être
looked at,
mesurée en termes de risque,
that
mais
could
qui
be
sait
measured in
aussi
terms of
être
risks,
mesurée
but
en
could also
termes
be
de
measured
rentabilité.
in
Et
terms
quand je
of
parle de
profitability.
rentabilité, ce
And when
n'est
I
pas
talk about
uniquement que la
profitability, it's not
rentabilité
just
financière, elle est
financial
nécessaire puisqu'elle
returns or
permet de
profitability, which is
rémunérer l'épargne
necessary
qui est gérée,
because we have to
mais aussi
remunerate
une
savings
rentabilité
that is
qui peut
managed, but
avoir des
also
effets sur
profitability that can have
l'économie et
an
sur le
effect
social.
on the
Moi, je
economy
pense
and on
c'est une
society.
piste qui
I
peut
believe
avoir du
it's
sens dans la
an
durée
avenue
et qui
that
peut
may have
constituer un
meaning
framework
to pursue
à
over
développer
time
de manière
and
toujours
should make us develop
de
frameworks
manière concertée entre les
in a concerted
investisseurs, les
manner
régulateurs, les
between
banques
investors,
de
regulators,
développement et qui
development banks,
permettrait d'aller de l'avant pour
and would make
ancrer
it move,
cette
make
tendance
it
de
possible to move
manière
forward
forte
to create
dans
that
la durée.
trend over time.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you.
Alors, pour la banque, ouais, ça fait que des développements.
For the
Il
West African
faudrait
Development
comprendre
Bank,
que nous,
we should understand that
notre capital
our
est structuré de telle façon que
capital is structured in such manner
nos emprunteurs sont
that our
en même
borrowers,
temps, enfin,
at the same
ceux à qui
time,
on prête de l'argent
the
sont
people who are
en
borrowing
même temps nos
money are
actionnaires.
also our
Donc,
shareholders.
nous, quand il s'agit de critères,
When
vraiment,
we talk about
on
criteria,
voilà, c'est légèrement politique. Hein.
it's just a bit
Nous
political,
essayons, en tout cas,
and we try
d'avoir
in all events to
une
have
égalité secteur privé, secteur public.
equality
Où,
between the public and private
actuellement, je pense
sectors,
qu'on est à
where
60-40,
at the moment we're at 60-40%, 60%
public et puis l'autre secteur
public
privé.
loans
Mais nous
and
essayons d'avoir un
40%
secteur
private.
50, ce qui n'est pas
But we try to
toujours,
get to
toujours
50-50,
facile.
which isn't always
Il y a
easy.
le volet risque, le
There's
département
the
risque,
risk
nous le
aspect.
regardons souvent. Enfin,
We
parce
look
que
at
moi, je vais
that.
de l'opération.
Well,
Donc,
I do this in
regarde
operations,
toujours avec
so
un
we always
œil
look
rouge, on se dit, ouais, ils
with
vont dire non tout de suite. Mais
a frown
carrément,
because
c'est
they're thinking
protéger
they'll
la
always say
banque et
no,
donc
but obviously it's a part of
cet
bank's
aspect
job.
là-dedans,
So we
c'est que
understand
veut
this
dire que
aspect,
nous devons trouver des
which
moyens
means
pour
we
dérisquer
need to
effectivement
look
les
at all kinds
opérations
of things
que
to
nous
reduce the risk in
apportons
operations
au
that
niveau de
we
la
offer
banque et c'est
at
sur ça
the
qu'on
bank's
travaille
level.
actuellement.
And that's
Et
what
je
we're
pense que
working
ce
on at
qui
the
va se
moment.
faire également au niveau de
And that's what's
notre,
going to happen
plus souvent encore au niveau de
more
notre,
often
de notre stratégie prochaine.
in our subsequent strategies.
J'aimerais bien rebondir sur
I want to react
l'aspect
to the aspects
harmonisation effectivement
of harmonization
des critères
of
et
criteria.
consorts. Vous savez, nous avons essayé de faire
we tried to
la réaccréditation auprès du Fonds vert, par exemple,
ensure
qui nous a pris
reaccreditation with
pratiquement
the fund,
2 à 3
and
ans,
it took us to
même
nearly
si on
2-3
était
years,
accrédité.
even though we'd already been accredited.
Et dès qu'on a fini cela, il fallait faire
And
pour le
once we
FERDI.
finished that, we had to do it for another institution.
Heureusement qu'on ne devait pas faire pour le fonds
Now, once
d'adaptation,
again,
parce que
we
le
didn't
fonds
have to do it for the
d'adaptation, lui, il est
adaptation fund
plutôt sur les
because that
rapports et consorts.
is more to do
Mais
with
c'est pour
other
vous
reports.
dire que effectivement,
But
si
to
on
tell
avait
you
une
that
harmonisation de tous ces critères,
if
là,
we
ça allait
had a
faciliter
harmonization of all these
effectivement la
criteria, it would
mise en
make it
œuvre et la
much easier
mobilisation
to implement
effectivement des
and
ressources
mobilize
auprès de ces fonds,
resources,
ce qui est souvent difficile.
which
Donc,
is
de
often difficult.
l'origination
So from origination
à l'obtention du
to
financement,
obtaining
pratiquement avec le fonds
financing
vert,
with a
si
green
tout
fund,
est bon et si
if
tout va
everything
bien,
goes well,
on est pratiquement à 2 ans.
it takes
Donc,
practically
des
2 years.
fois, même les critères qui ont permis
So sometimes even
à
criteria that made
sélectionner
it
le
possible
projet,
to select a
développer la
project,
note conceptuelle et le faire
develop
proposal,
it in conceptual
à
terms,
la fin ou à
and make
l'obtention du
a bid,
financement ne
but
sont
at the end,
souvent pas les
getting
mêmes
the
choses.
financing,
Donc, il faut
it's not
encore
often the same
redimensionner
thing,
le
so
projet
it
des
has to be
fois, ce qui
resized,
demande encore des
which
ressources encore
often
additionnelles.
requires additional
Nous,
resources.
pour le secteur privé,
For
nous
us,
avons
for
remarqué
the
également
private
que
sector, we've noted
lorsqu'ils nous
that
approchaient, la
when they
plupart du
approached
temps,
us,
ils n'avaient
most
pas
of
les
the time,
ressources
they didn't have the
pour
resources
maturer les
to
projets. Donc, ça veut dire qu'il y avait des projets qui
mature these
n'avaient pas,
projects.
qui étaient
So
de très belles
there
idées,
were
mais qui
projects,
n'avaient
there were
pas
some very
d'études et
fine ideas,
consorts. Donc,
but
ce
they
que nous
hadn't
avons
been
essayé de
studied.
faire, c'est de
So
monter
what
pour
we try to
l'étude
do
climat,
is to set up
qui
a
a été
climate
également
study
demandée partiellement par l'AFD,
that had been
et
requested
également
in
des
part by
ressources.
the AFD
Et
and also
ceci a permis
resources,
quand même d'aider
and
le
this has
secteur
made it
privé
possible for the private
fast-track le
sector
process parce que
to fast
au lieu
track the
de faire
process,
une demande de PPF
because instead
auprès
of making a
du fonds
PPF
vert,
request
il
for
fallait
the green
directement venir
fund,
vers nous et
they
s'appuyer
could
sur ce
come to
fonds-là
us directly,
pour qu'on vous
and
fasse, on
that
finance les études
we
et
said
consorts pour que ça
will
aille plus
finance
vite.
the
Donc,
studies to
les
make it go
2 ans
faster.
normalement sont réduits,
And those 2
ce qui nous
years are
permet d'aller un
reduced,
peu plus vite encore
which
sur le
makes it
terrain.
possible
Donc,
to go a little
voilà
faster.
un peu ce que nous avons essayé de faire
That's
sur
what we try to
cela.
do
Donc, en termes de freins, effectivement, c'est
in
ça,
terms of
c'est
obstacles
le
as
manque
well. It's the
de
lack
ressources
of
pour ces
resources
études-là, mais nous avons
for those studies
essayé effectivement
that
d'avoir ce
we
fonds
did try to
et nous
have that
essayons encore d'en
from
faire
the fund,
plus
and we're
dans
still
notre
trying to do
prochaine
even more
stratégie
in our
Voilà,
next
merci.
strategic plan. Thank
Alors,
you.
merci beaucoup.
So
Alors,
thank you very
Thomas
much.
doit nous quitter, mais
Thomas
on
has to
va
leave us,
avoir le temps de prendre quelques
but
questions
we will have the
à la
time to take a
fois
few
de la
questions,
salle, s'il y en
both
a,
from
ou
the room
de l'auditoire.
and also the auditorium.
Oui.
Vous avez beaucoup insisté à juste
You've
titre sur le fait
rightly
que
emphasized
la
at
finance
length
climat et
the
la
fact
finance
that climate
développement ont beaucoup de
financing
points
and
communs.
development financing
Quand
have a
on
lot of
finance du
points in
développement,
common.
mais on
And
peut en
when we
même temps
finance
financer
development,
de
we can also
l'adaptation ou de
finance
l'atténuation.
adaptation or
Mais alors,
attenuation.
ma question, c'est quand
But
même
my
qu'en
question
Afrique,
is
il y a un
that
besoin de
in
financement
Africa,
très
there is a
important de
need
l'éducation
for
et de la
financing that's
santé.
significant in
Alors, est-ce
education and
que
health.
le fait que vous vous intéressez
Now, the
beaucoup au
fact that you're
climat,
interested
est-ce que ça fait
enormously in
que
the
vous financez
climate, does
moins
that mean
ou
that you
plus du
don't
tout
finance as much, or
la
if at
santé,
all,
l'éducation? Ou au
health,
contraire, est-ce que
education,
vous
or on the
gardez un peu de
contrary,
marge de manœuvre
are
dans
you
ces deux
keeping
domaines
a
qui sont,
margin
à
for
mon avis,
maneuver
absolument
in these
fondamentaux
fields,
pour
which I
l'Afrique,
believe
l'avenir de
are
l'Afrique et
absolutely
son développement?
fundamental
On
for
va prendre une
Africa's
autre
future and
question,
development?
s'il y en
We'll
a
take
une
another question as well
dans l'audience.
from the audience.
Non, bah dans ce cas-là, je vous...
In that case, who would like to answer?
Alors, je commence et puis je passe le micro.
I'll start and then I'll hand over to my colleagues.
Avant 2021,
Before
nous
2021,
appuyons uniquement sur les requêtes
we
de
would look
financement venant des
only
États.
at
C'est-à-dire qu'on se
financing
dit
requests
que les États connaissent
for
leurs
this.
priorités. Ils viennent vers nous avec leurs priorités pour le
They know our
financement.
priorities.
À partir de 2021,
But
notre
from
stratégie a changé.
2021
Nous avons
onwards,
même
our
créé des
strategic
départements
approach, we even
santé et
created
éducation.
departments
Ce qui veut dire que nous
for health and
comprenons
education.
le
So we
besoin qu'il y a
understand the
aujourd'hui
need
et nous le
today,
finançons directement.
and we'd finance it
Mais nous avons
directly. But
intégré le climat dans
we've
toutes
also
les
integrated
opérations de la
climate
banque.
in
Ce qui veut dire
all these
que ce soit
operations for the bank.
éducation, que ce
That
soit santé,
it can be
l'aspect
educational
climat et
health.
environnement est
The
pris en compte.
climate and environment aspects
Donc,
are taken taken into account. So it's transversal. And perhaps also, even though we still carry on finance health and education at the level of BOED.
Merci beaucoup.
Well, thank you very much.
En 2017,
In 2017, the AFD adopted a strategy that is 100% aligned with the Paris Agreement Accords. In other words, to date, we'd agreed that to allocate 50% of all financing into climate with a climate qualification
compté dans les principes communs du climat. Et les 50
the common
autres
principles.
nous
And the other
étions
50%,
interrogés, mais alors,
we wondered
que
about
va-t-on
that,
faire
and
avec
we
les
said, well,
50
what are we going to do
autres
with those other
Et
50%?
alors, on s'est engagé
We
sur un
committed then
alignement 100% avec l'accord de
for
Paris. Ça veut dire que
alignment of
l'intégralité
100%
du
alignment with the
financement
Paris Accord.
est
In
alignée
other words,
avec les
all
principes de
financing
l'accord
is
de
aligned
Paris,
with the
c'est-à-dire au moins
principles
ne
of the
pas
Paris Accord,
nuire
at least
au
not to
climat
harm
et
the climate
à l'environnement. On
and
vient
the environment.
d'adopter un autre objectif
We've
qui est
just adopted another
l'alignement aussi
objective, which is
100%
to
avec
align
l'accord, le
with
cadre mondial pour la
the
biodiversité
global
qui nous vient de
framework
Montréal,
for
qui vient
biodiversity from
s'ajouter. Donc, on a
Montreal,
maintenant
which
un
has
double
been
défi.
added. So we have a
Je
twofold alignment.
voudrais aussi
I'd
préciser
also like to stipulate
qu'actuellement,
that at present,
les octrois de financement que
the
nous faisons
granting
dans le
of
secteur de la
financing
santé
in the health
sont
sector
qualifiés à 75%
are
de finances
qualified
climat. Donc, en
as
réalité, c'est pas du tout
75% of them are
incompatible.
qualified as climate
Même
financing.
dans le
So
secteur de
they're not
la santé,
incompatible. Even in the health
on
sector,
travaille sur une trajectoire de
we are working
décarbonation du secteur de la
on a
santé. On travaille sur
decarbonation
le lien entre
trajectory. We're
certaines
working on the
épidémies
link between specific
et le
epidemics
réchauffement
and
climatique
global warming.
et encore plein d'autres projets qui sont
And
tout à
again,
fait
many other projects that are
alignés avec les considérations
fully
climat.
aligned with
Donc,
the climate considerations.
pour l'instant,
I'd say for the
ce
time
ne sont pas
being
des
that
priorités qui
these
se
are not
concrétisent.
contradictory priorities.
Je vais être un peu provocatrice.
I might be a bit provocative.
Votre question est une très bonne question.
Yours is a
Et
very
en
good
tant
question. And
qu'entité
as
publique en Afrique, nous sommes
an entity, a public
inquiets
entity,
pour
in
la même
Africa,
raison.
we are worried for the same
Parce que
reasons.
pour la santé, on peut
Because
faire de la santé
for health, you can talk about
compatible avec le
health
climat, mais
to make it
l'éducation
compatible
primaire,
with climate change, but which
la
one?
vaccination. Comment on fait pour que la
Vaccination.
vaccination soit verte?
How do you ensure that vaccination
Et
is paid out?
dans mon expérience, ça fait maintenant 20 ans,
In
j'ai
my
travaillé
experience,
beaucoup dans
and
le
I've
ministère des
been
Finances.
working for 20
En
years in
2003, je
finance
me rappelle
ministries,
quand
in
on avait approché la Banque mondiale pour demander un
2003,
prêt
when we
d'urgence pour nous
contacted
aider
the
avec
World Bank for
une
an
crise qu'on
emergency
avait
loan
au
for a
niveau de
crisis
l'électricité.
we
La Banque
had
mondiale, à l'époque,
regarding
nous avait dit, ne vous
electricity,
inquiétez
the
pas de
World Bank said,
l'électricité et
don't
du
worry
digital.
about
Commencez d'abord
electricity and digital.
par
Start
l'éducation, la
with
santé et la
education,
protection
health,
sociale.
and
Le Rwanda a
welfare.
insisté, on a finalement eu
Rwanda
notre
insisted,
prêt
and
après
we
3
finally
ans
got our loan after 3 years
d'attente et de
of
débat. Et je
waiting
souriais
and discussion, and I
la
was
semaine passée quand
smiling
j'étais à Washington et la Banque
last
mondiale
week when I was
poussait
in
pour la
Washington
mission
and the World
300,
Bank was there.
qui est
We were
maintenant
there
le
for Mission
centre,
300, which is the center.
comment je dirais, c'est le secteur le plus sexy à
It's the
Washington aujourd'hui,
sexiest
c'est l'énergie.
the
Il y a
sexiest
20
thing
ans, personne ne voulait entendre
in
parler de
Washington. It's
l'énergie
energy.
parce que
20 years ago, no
c'était
one
pas
would
censé
talk
être
about
une
energy
priorité pour
because it wasn't
l'Afrique.
supposed to be a
Mais
priority
il y a 20 ans,
for
c'était déjà
Africa.
une priorité
But
pour
20
l'Afrique. Il
years
y a
ago,
20
it
ans, on
was
savait
already a
déjà qu'on n'aurait
priority.
pas une croissance
And 20 years ago,
sur le long
we didn't
terme
have
si on n'a pas accès à
long-term growth
l'électricité.
without access
Et donc,
to electricity.
les bailleurs de
And
fonds,
therefore,
les partenaires ont des
the
cycles
finances
où ils aiment certains
partners have
secteurs mieux
cycles
que
where they
d'autres.
like some
Nous,
sectors
en
more
tant
than others.
qu'agents de l'État, on a l'habitude.
We, as
On sait que certains
an agent of the
secteurs
state, we're used to
seront
it.
mis à
We know that
l'avant
some
plus que
sectors
d'autres.
will be
Mais
highlighted more than
pour les
others,
agents de l'État dans les pays africains, la
but
responsabilité,
for
c'est de
various
donner
reasons, their
tous les services
responsibility of the
publics.
states is to provide every
C'est de
public
donner
service,
accès à l'eau, c'est de
is
donner
to
accès à
ensure access to
l'électricité,
water,
c'est donner accès au
electricity,
monde digital, donner
to the
accès,
digital
s'assurer
world,
que la lutte contre le
to
changement climatique, qui est
ensure
une
that
réalité,
measures against climate
qui n'est
change,
pas un
which is a
slogan.
reality
Les gens qui habitent
in
sur les
Africa.
collines au Rwanda
People living
sont
on the
les
hills in
premières victimes
Rwanda
du
are the
changement
first
climatique, même s'ils
victims
n'ont
of
jamais
climate
pollué de leur
change
vie.
or global
Et
warming,
donc,
even
tout
if
ça,
they
sont
never
des
polluted
réalités
their
sur le
lives.
terrain dont nous, on a
Now, all
l'habitude.
this is a reality in the
Et
field. We're used to it.
maintenant, on a appris un petit peu
And now
à
we've
gérer ces
learned
vagues. Et
to
donc,
manage these
il faut aussi,
waves.
c'est là où il faut se rappeler que
That's where we have
il
to
y a
remember
l'argent des bailleurs de
that
fonds, mais il y a aussi le
there's
budget
money from
national.
finances, but there's also
Et
the
donc,
national budget.
le rôle du budget
And
national
the
dans beaucoup de
role
pays
of the national
d'Afrique, je peux
budget
vous
in
dire,
many
en tant qu'ancien
African
agent
countries, and I can
du
say this
ministère
as
des
a
Finances,
former
c'est d'avoir un rôle un peu
representative of the
contre-cyclique.
finances, is to
Et
be
donc, quand les
rather
bailleurs quittent un
counter-cyclical.
secteur,
And when finances
le budget
leave one
national,
sector,
il y reste.
the
Et il
national
essaye
budget has to
de
stay
dépenser un peu plus
or
des
tries to
recettes
spend a bit
nationales
more.
sur ce
But in
secteur.
that approach,
Donc,
in
je
that
pense que votre
sector,
question est une question très pertinente. Et la manière dont ça se
So it's
gère
a
au niveau
very
national, c'est à
relevant
travers
question,
le
and the
budget.
way we
Il y
manage
avait
this nationally is
un
through
financement
the
qui, des fois, est un peu
budget, through a
contre-cyclique
financing
par rapport aux
sometimes,
secteurs qui
which
sont pas à
is
la mode. Mais les
counter-cyclical
secteurs à la mode,
compared
il y en
to
aura
the
toujours.
trendy sectors. But you'll
Je
always
pense que ce
have
qui est
trendy
important, c'est qu'on
sectors.
reste
What is
focalisé sur les
important
besoins de la
is that we
population
focus on the
et
needs
que
of the
l'argent de l'aide
population
publique au
and the
développement
money
puisse,
of
ressources nationales, à la fin,
coming from
arrive
national resources and
à donner un service
public
de base à la
assistance
population sur
provide
tous
a
les secteurs.
basic service to the population across the board.
On ne peut pas ne pas parler de santé et d'éducation qui sont les bases
Health and
du développement
education are intertwined. They are the basis of development in a country. Let me take as an anchor in Morocco the recommendations of our king. There should be indication from the very early ages. I will tell you how a number of institutions intervene on this, even if this is part of the mandate of the public authorities. Health should be for everybody. We had a speech in 2020 by the king about this. The king insisted on the widespread protection, health protection. It generalizes compulsory social security. Today, 25 million Moroccans families are within this mandatory social security so that each and everyone can access to healthcare. This implies to have the men and women to provide care and the infrastructure. The men and women, doctors, nurses, and others. These training courses are taking place in the public sector through a number of verticals, but through the private sector also, thanks to special training courses. Then what about infrastructure? Well, obviously, infrastructure, and during these periods in each country, you have finance projects or the 2026 Finance Act provides for an increase of 120 billion dirhams, 240 billion guns in these sectors. So we have, it's the equivalent of 170 billion euros. That's a 20% increase in these sectors. That is the infrastructure, an infrastructure financed by the 2020 budget, hospitals, healthcare institutions, but there's also an infrastructure which is more and more akin to finances that could be driven and structured through institutionals and could be provided in a rental way to the players that provide care. And this is where investors or that other investors come in because they have the equity. They are looking for a profitability which is not necessarily one advocated by the private sector and can look at the collective interest and the profitability. Take into account these two factors. The same thing you find in education through mechanisms where the infrastructure has always to be carried and financed by third parties which are close to the public sphere so that we can keep a number of capabilities to be dedicated to the training of young people, to upgrading the further education to follow in these footsteps. You are right, madam. These things remain the foundations of a consistency and remain the basis of a society which is developing. One last question from the floor.
Oui,
I thank all the speakers. We had over about 300 people online on the web. Many questions focusing on topics already dealt with. Maybe one question which is about the most vulnerable populations in a budgetary context, which is shrinking. What are the criteria that decide about budgets or finances that are directed to more vulnerable populations or are more dedicated to transition related projects? What are the criteria you are using for this purpose?
La caractérisation climat de nos opérations.
Climate characterization of our operations is across the board. You have education, health, transportation, energy are all involved, and our analysis is cross-cutting. Each project goes to our department in order to improve its performance when it comes to adapting to the climate change or reducing CO2. In terms of allocating climate funding, projects originate from the countries in which we work. The resources being limited, then out of necessity, the allocation of budgetary resources goes to countries that are either not able or have less ability to borrow, and resource in terms of loans preferably will be allocated to people which are able to borrow. The adaptation to climate change is rather a project class that will be applied to vulnerable countries in terms of climate change, whilst projects related to low carbon projects will involve more emerging economies. These are the major thrusts of our resource allocations.
Merci.
Thank you.
Je dirais il y a deux grands axes.
There are
quand
two
on
main
pense à la transition climatique
prongs when we
et
talk
au rôle
about
de la
climate
transition versus
transition
les populations
and
vulnérables.
the role
Le
of
premier axe, c'est
transition
vraiment
versus
tout ce qui est
vulnerable
protection sociale,
populations.
c'est-à-dire
First
les
of
gens
all,
qui habitent dans les
social
zones à danger,
protection. People who
qui
live
sont
in
plus impactés
dangerous,
par le changement
risky
climatique
areas
et
who are more affected by climate
c'est pas de leur
change.
faute, quoi.
Well, it's not their fault, as we
S'il n'y a
say.
pas un business
There's
bancable
no
derrière
bankable business
relocalisation
in terms of
des populations qui habitent
relocating
sur les collines,
the
qui font
inhabitants
partie
that
des groupes les
live
plus
on the
vulnérables. Et ça,
hills
c'est
that are
vraiment de
part of
l'ordre
the more
de la
vulnerable
protection
groups. This
sociale
is
qui, en
more about
général,
the social
est un
protection,
rôle
which
de
in
base
general is a
de
basic
l'administration
role
publique et du
of the
gouvernement.
public
Le
administration
deuxième
or the
axe, je
government. Now,
pense,
the second
maintenant,
axis,
est devenu
which
de
now has
l'utilité publique, c'est
become
que
well
la
known,
meilleure façon de
the
combattre
best
la
way
pauvreté,
to
c'est pas les
combat
dons, c'est de
poverty,
créer des
it's not
emplois.
about
Et
donations,
je
but
pense
it's
que
to
maintenant,
create
le débat
jobs.
est
And now
finalement
the
au
debate
centre,
finally is
où
at
on
the
arrête de
center,
penser que tout
where
va
we've
être,
stopped thinking
tous les
that
solutions
everything,
viendront
all the solutions will be
de la
coming
charité et de la protection
from
sociale. En Afrique, il y a une
charity and
population, une démographie
social
très jeune.
protection. We
Ce que
have
les jeunes
very
veulent,
young
c'est pas des dons,
populations.
c'est
What the
des
young
emplois.
people want
Et
jobs,
donc,
not
ça fait
loans
vraiment
or
plaisir de voir que
donations. So
finalement,
we are
les
pleased to
grands
see
débats au
that the
niveau
major debates
internationaux, je disais
internationally,
la semaine
as
passée
I said
aux
last
assemblées
week
annuelles, c'est vraiment emploi,
in the
emploi, emploi.
AGM,
Et
is
emploi via
about
l'éducation,
jobs.
emploi
Jobs
via la
mean
formation,
involve
emploi
training,
avec une bonne
education,
santé, emploi
good
avec
health. They
investissement
necessitate
dans les PME,
investments in
des petites et
SMEs,
moyennes compagnies créatrices
SMIs,
d'emplois,
and,
emploi veut
and
dire investissement dans
jobs
les
involves
startups.
investing in
Et donc, je
startups.
pense que le financement, le
So
rôle du secteur
the
financier
role
dans
of
la
the
lutte contre le changement
financial
climatique,
sector
c'est
in
aussi de créer
regard
des
to
emplois. C'est
climate change
surtout
is
créer des
also to
emplois.
create jobs. It's
Et
above all
tant qu'on
creating
n'arrive pas à
jobs.
marier les
And as
deux,
long as we cannot
on va
combine
rater
the two,
cette
we will have
opportunité
missed this
extraordinaire. Et
extraordinary
donc, il y a
opportunity.
beaucoup d'emplois qui peuvent
So there are
être
many
créés
jobs that could
dans
be
le contexte de
created
la lutte
in the context
contre le
of
changement climatique.
combating the
Je donnerai
climate
un exemple.
change.
Au Rwanda,
Let me
par
give you an
exemple, les
example.
motos.
In Rwanda,
On a un
for
problème
example,
de transport public
motorcycles. We have a problem of
et une des
public
solutions locales, c'est
transportation.
les motos,
One
les
of
motos électriques. Et pour
electric
les jeunes, les motos électriques, c'est une solution parce qu'ils n'ont
motorbikes
pas
are
de
a
coût,
solution because there's no
mensuel pour aller à la station
monthly
d'essence
cost.
pour
They
faire
don't need
descendre. Donc, ça crée énormément
put
d'emplois.
gas, petrol into
Donc, il y a
their
beaucoup
vehicles.
d'opportunités comme
So
ça qui
this,
sont
there are
un peu
many
dans
opportunities such as these, which are in the
entre,
intersection
la lutte
between
contre le changement
the fight
climatique
against
et
climate
la
change
création
and
d'emplois.
the
Je pense que c'est
creation of
vraiment
jobs.
un
Really,
rôle
this is a role
que jouent les
that
banques de développement
play
qu'on
the
doit pousser
development
à faire
banks and that
véritablement
we
à
will
terme.
push forward as much as we can. Thank you.
Juste un mot. En réalité,
In reality,
rien ne s'oppose.
nothing
C'est que le
is
fil conducteur, c'est
contradicting.
l'inclusion.
What
C'est
the
l'inclusion de
main,
la population de
the
manière
red
globale.
line is
Et
inclusion.
quand il y a
Include
une
when there
partie de la
is
population
part of the population
qui est vulnérable,
which is
là, il y a des
vulnerable,
amortisseurs qui sont
then
faits
there
et
are
ça, c'est
some
en général
things
le
that
budget,
dampen.
étatique qui apporte un
It's
certain
usually the
nombre
state
d'amortissements. Pendant ce
budget that
temps-là,
provides
il faudrait que
a
cette
few.
inclusion-là puisse passer par de l'inclusion
This inclusion
territoriale,
requires
créer de
territorial
l'emploi, encourager l'entreprise.
inclusion, encourage
C'est
companies,
toujours
create jobs,
ensemble. Aujourd'hui, on ne
always
peut
together.
plus prendre le
Today,
sujet de
we
manière
cannot afford
verticale.
to take things,
On veut faire de l'efficacité énergétique de la banque
topics
comme ça, sans voir les
vertically.
impacts sur
We
l'autre
need to look
secteur.
at
On
the
travaille sur
impact
la
of things. We are
mobilité
working on
de cette
mobility
manière-là.
in that
Disons
way.
avec une vision
The vision
d'ensemble, en
is
mettant bien
across the board
évidemment un
by,
certain
of
nombre
course,
d'enjeux,
putting
je
in
dirais
place a
mondiaux,
number of global
nous sommes dans
challenges, taking them
une
into
planète qui
account
connaît un
on a
réchauffement
planet
climatique
that sees
important.
a
Par
major
rapport à notre
climate
continent, on
warming
connaît
compared to our
quels sont les impacts.
we
Et
know
par
what
rapport
are
à
the
chaque
impacts,
pays,
and
on
regard
sait
to each
qu'il y a
country,
une
we know
cohérence à garder.
that there is
Et c'est
some
toujours
consistency
cette
that needs to
cohérence-là
be kept,
et
and
c'est
this is
notre
the
inclusion qu'il faut
consistency
faire
and that
entre
inclusion
d'abord
mode that has to
le
be
secteur
taking place
public
between the
ou
public
la
sector
puissance publique,
and the
les
public
institutions
government,
financières
the
publiques
financial
qui jouent ce rôle de
institutions, the
bridge,
public
mais
ones,
aussi le privé
but also the
qu'il faut
private
savoir
sector
dérisquer et lui
that we need
apporter
to help
aussi un certain nombre de
de-risk itself
réponses
and
pour
provide a number
aller
of
ensemble
responses to
vers
move
ça.
together
Une
towards
entreprise
that.
gagnerait
A
plus d'argent
company would
quand elle est dans
gain
un
more
climat
money if it
de
is
confiance, qui soutient un certain stabilité, une
it
cohérence
feels
ADN.
trust and if there's
Je ne veux pas utiliser
stability
le terme comme il
in
faut, mais
its
en tout cas, dans sa zone
sphere, in its
d'activité ou dans ces
business
zones dans lesquelles elle a
region or in
de
the
l'intérêt
area
commercial.
where it
Et c'est
has a
ça
commercial
le maître mot.
interest.
Moi, je
And
souhaite
this
finir
is
sur
the
ça.
key word. I would like to end on this.
Inclusion, réfléchir
Inclusion,
collectif et
think
surtout
collectively,
vivre
and above
collectif.
all,
Parce qu'on a
act
réfléchi, on sait le
collectively,
faire.
because we are
Alors de
good
là à
at
ça,
thinking. We are
partager un
now
certain
sharing
nombre
a number
d'idées qui sont
of
pratiques,
ideas which are
un certain
practical,
nombre de
a
volontés,
number
mais c'est
of
l'action
wills, but it's
sur le terrain
action
de
on the
manière
ground
collective qui
collectively
permettrait
that will
d'avancer
allow
et
to
d'avancer de
move
manière
forward
sereine,
and
de
move
manière durable
serenely,
au bénéfice de nos
sustainably for
populations
the benefit of our
respectives.
populations.
On arrive au terme de la
We are
session
coming
d'aujourd'hui, donc je
to
voulais
the end of
terminer
our
sur le mot
session. Let
collectif
me
parce
end
que
on the word
vous nous
collective.
avez montré
You
justement
have shown
à quel
us
point vous
to what
aviez
extent
l'occasion de travailler
you had an opportunity
ensemble,
to work
à la fois en
together,
combinant différents
both by
objectifs qui
combining
sont loin
different
d'être
goals
contradictoires.
which are not in
Je voulais en profiter
contradiction with
aussi
each
pour vous
other.
remercier
I would
chaleureusement
like to
pour
thank
la
you very
participation
warmly for
aujourd'hui,
your
en particulier
participation
pour ceux
today,
qui ont fait
especially
le
for those
déplacement,
who
et puis
traveled
aussi
to
les
come here,
organisateurs
and also the
et les participants.
organizers and
Je vous donne
participants.
rendez-vous demain pour
We
la
will meet
dernière
tomorrow for
séance
the last session,
qui portera sur
which
le
will
rôle des
be
banques
dealing
centrales.
with the role
Et
of
je vous remercie
central
beaucoup
banks. And I
pour
thank you very
l'attention
much
et
for
votre
your
participation.
attention and your participation today. Thank you again.